This is the Monoprice Monolith THX 365T bookshelf loudspeaker, but for the sake of my sanity, I'm just going to refer to it as the 365 from this point moving forward. And what you're also looking at is Monoprice's very first entry into the enthusiast loudspeaker market. Now, because this product is geared towards both multi-channel users and two-channel users, I need to lay down the disclaimer that for this review, I'm only going to evaluate it from the context of how it performs in a traditional two-channel stereo system. So, with that being said, let's roll the intro so I can talk about the design and, of course, how it performs. Alright guys, so here it is, and because there's so much ground to cover, I'm just going to jump straight into this. So what you're looking at here with the 365 is a very large three-way monitor. Now it's going to be a sealed design, meaning that there's no port either in the front or the back of the speaker, and it's going to be very well made. While most speakers are made of MDF material for the cabinet, Monoprice went with HDF, which is a higher quality material, giving each speaker a weight of nearly 30 pounds apiece, which honestly is pretty impressive. Now, when it comes to the price, they retail for $1,000 a pair. And before I talk about things like the driver configuration and all that, I first want to share with you all what Monoprice was going for with this speaker, because they made an unusual design choice, and this is basically what's up. So you look at something like this and you may be thinking, wow, this speaker must output a hell of a lot of bass given its size. And the answer to that is, no, it actually doesn't. In fact, this speaker drops off pretty sharply at 80 hertz, and that was done on purpose. Because when Monoprice sat down to design these speakers, they said, okay, we want something that has a flat frequency response, we want good on and off axis performance, and we want something that exhibits exceptional power handling, good dynamics. We want something to where you can put it in a big room, crank it up, and experience distortion-free sound. In order to do that, you have to make sacrifices, and in this case, it's going to be bass, because if you have relatively affordable woofers moving back and forth, well, that's going to introduce distortion when they're tasked to play both mid-range and bass frequencies. And on top of that, it makes them more power hungry, it limits dynamic range. So they said, you know what, we're going to make the sacrifice of foregoing bass for the sake of all of our other goals. And I asked them, I was like, you know, I appreciate that, but isn't that going to make this more of a niche product? I mean, how many people are going to buy a subwoofer to go with these? And their answer was, well, in our experience, Monolith customers are experienced enthusiasts. They're not the normal Best Buy shopper. They're not people who are doing this for the first time. So they're going to look at this. They're going to recognize what we're going for here, which in this case is going to be purely mid-range and treble performance. And they're going to accept that, hey, I need a subwoofer with these, and when you pair everything together, that's when you're going to get a proper full-range, distortion-free experience. So we'll see how the market responds to that, but this is basically what they were going for. Now I'm going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to take a look at what else you get with this speaker. Alright guys, so now that I'm hydrated, let's take a closer look at what you get with these speakers, starting with the drivers. So as mentioned before, this is going to be a three-way design. It uses your typical NTM configuration, and let's begin by looking in the center here. So on top, you're going to notice a 1-inch soft dome tweeter, and beneath that is going to be something that may be a little bit unusual to you guys, and that's going to be what looks like a larger tweeter that's actually a mid-range driver. Now this is going to be something that's designed to handle frequencies between 550 hertz and 1.9 kilohertz, and there's a lot of advantages to going with something like this. Number one, it's going to help with the integration between the tweeter and the woofers. Number two, because it's so low mass, it's going to help everything to sound more balanced, and you're going to help achieve that better frequency response. And then of course there's going to be power handling capabilities. Of course, this is something that's unusual. Not too many companies go in this direction outside of maybe ATC, PMC, NHT on the affordable side, and a few other companies. And that's because implementing a driver like this is actually pretty difficult to do, let alone in a very affordable product. So I applaud Monoprice for going in this direction. Now, on the top and on the bottom, we're going to notice two 6.5-inch woofers. I believe Monoprice said they're made of long fiber pulp material with rubber surrounds, whatever that means to you. So now let's take a look at the back. Actually, before we take a look at the back, I almost forgot. On the top here, we're going to have our Atmos speakers. Is going to be a 5.5-inch woofer with a 0.6-inch tweeter. On the bottom, they actually have these rubber feet, which in this case is actually pretty nice. And now on the back, you're going to notice the nice curvature of the cabinet here. you're also going to notice our binding posts. So if you're connecting these speakers to a stereo system, or if you're not running Atmos, just use the bottom terminals. If you're going to use Atmos, then you're going to have your top terminals up here. Now, it's important to note that unless you're running Atmos, these top speakers are not going to play. Anyways, guys, that's going to be the 365. Now, let's talk about how it actually sounds. Alright guys, so when it comes to the performance, let's just get the obvious out of the way. These speakers were designed to be used with a subwoofer, and if you don't plan on using a subwoofer with them, then this is going to be an easy pass just because there's not a whole lot of bass here. Now, with that being said, let's talk about the overall character and what you could expect out of the 365s. So in short, this is going to be a speaker that's all about giving you a huge sense of scale, particularly throughout the mid-range and the treble. This is going to be a speaker that's more about accuracy and balance and linearity than something that's voiced to impress you with super bright sounding treble or very punchy and strong sounding bass. Granted, there ain't much bass here, but you get what I'm laying down. So when you get right down to it, in my experience so far, this has been one of the most accurate sounding passive loudspeakers at $1,000 that I've come across. And that's really quite impressive considering the complexity of the design and the fact that it's actually a Dolby Atmos speaker. Still, it's not perfectly linear, and that leads me, of course, to the individual aspects of its performance, starting with the treble. So this is where you're going to deviate the most from linearity because the treble is going to be boosted up a little bit. But interestingly enough, I feel like when you pair it with a good subwoofer, that becomes far less noticeable. In fact, in this world with very hyped up speakers at this price point, I'd imagine that a lot of you would actually feel like the treble on the 365 is going to be pretty smooth and easygoing. So it's going to depend on what your previous reference points are, but it still is going to be bumped up just a little bit. Now, when it comes to the overall performance of the top end, I think Monoprice did a good job of striking that balance between detail and smoothness and listenability. Because when you compare this to other products in the price point, like say the Triangles that I just reviewed, no, it's not nearly as airy sounding. It's not going to be quite as articulate and revealing, but on the other hand, it's going to be smoother. It's going to be better integrated with the rest of the presentation, allowing you to listen for longer periods of time without fatigue. So I think Monoprice did a pretty good job with that. Now, moving on to the mid-range. So the mid-range is going to lay down this huge sense of scale. I think a lot of you are going to like it. If anything, one could criticize the mid-range for being a little bit too large sounding with things like male and female vocalists, but nonetheless, it is going to be very pleasing sounding. I would even argue that it takes on a mildly dark, warm character, but is otherwise very balanced. A lot of texture, a lot of dimension. When you add a subwoofer to it, there ain't much to complain about. And now, let's move on to the bass. Sorry, there is hardly any bass to this sound. I mean, don't get me wrong, what little bass is there is very quick, as you would expect from a passive speaker, but there ain't much bass. You're going to need a sub with these. Moving on to dynamics. The dynamics aren't quite as explosive as I was expecting given their design goals, but they do showcase good dynamic range. And it's also interesting to note that these speakers actually sound really good at low volumes, which is something that I did not expect. Now let's talk about imaging. Imaging is going to be good. Look, it's not going to cast the widest soundstage on planet Earth, but I think it'll be sufficiently wide for most people. Really good image depth. I've come to find that these speakers sound best when you have either, have them towed out directly or pointed directly out into the room or with minimal toe in. But otherwise, yeah, the imaging is going to be pretty solid for what it is, showcasing really good on and off axis performance, meaning that you can walk around a room and the tonality of the speaker won't shift all too much at all, which again, given the complexity of the design and the price point, is pretty impressive. Still, they're not going to be perfect speakers, so now let's go over some of those imperfections now. You know, guys, when it comes to criticizing a unique product like this, it's easy to get caught up in semantics. For example, I can say that for the money, I can find speakers that are much fuller sounding, or I could find mini monitors that lay down a much wider soundstage, or something that's more refined, and the list goes on and on. But when doing so, you begin to lose. So here's the thing, guys. When criticizing unique speakers like this, it's easy to get caught up in semantics. For example, for $1,000, yeah, you can find fuller sounding speakers, or maybe you can find mini monitors that'll lay down a wider soundstage or something that's more refined, and the list goes on and on and on. But when you do that, you lose sight of what makes these speakers so special, which is going to be that huge sense of scale throughout the mid-range, really good balance and accuracy, really good on and off axis performance, and also the list goes on there. So I think the one thing that I could legitimately criticize is the fact that they're not really $1,000 speakers. Not really. because they were designed to be used with a subwoofer, that means, well, now you need to add the cost of a sub. And it can't be just any sub. It needs to be a good subwoofer because it needs to match the quick bass, what little bass is here on the speakers. Well, it needs to augment with that pretty seamlessly. So now you're probably going to be spending anywhere between $300 to $500 on just a single sub to go with these speakers. Now you're going to need good stands to go with them. That could cost anywhere between $60 to $200. And now all of a sudden, these $1,000 a pair speakers are competing against products that are more like $1,500 to $2,000. And while I think they compete very well when you add a sub into the mix, nonetheless, it's something that you need to consider. And that leads me to my final thoughts. So I'm going to wrap up this review by tipping my hat to how bold Monoprice has been with this speaker, because it's their first entry into the enthusiast market, and they could have easily voiced this large speaker to have the kind of bass and low and grunt that a lot of enthusiasts expect out of a speaker at this size, but they didn't do that. And that's because they had this vision. They wanted something that would augment a subwoofer. They wanted something that was low distortion. They wanted something that was easy to work with, something that's balanced sounding, something that sounds good on and off axis, while still having the kind of voicing to where you can listen to it for hours at a time and not get fatigued. And they're banking on there being enough people for this product to be a commercial success for them. And I think time will tell as to how that plays out, but I'll say this. If you're looking for a set of bookshelf speakers without a sub, then yeah, these are going to be an easy pass. But if you're somebody who's looking for what I just said, then I actually think they're definitely worth an audition if you can. Anyways, guys, that's going to be my take on these speakers. They're actually very, very enjoyable products. And when you pair them with a good subwoofer, I think they make for a really engaging full-range listening experience that at least had me tied to my chair for quite a few hours. So anyways, yep, that's my take on them. As always, thanks for watching, and until next time, peace.